Undefined and not defined are two terms you would see a lot when writing JavaScript. And they actually sound similar, right? I mean, in English, undefined, not defined, that feels like the same thing. Well, in JavaScript, these terms have their differences. So in this video, I'll be simplifying the difference between these two terms, and I'll also be showing you examples where something is undefined and when something is not defined. Still feels like the same thing. Anyways, let's look at examples. Here in my code, I have let YouTube channel. So I declare the YouTube channel variable name, but as you can see here, I didn't assign it any value like 20 or anything. I only declared the variable. Now let's say I try to do console log YouTube channel. If I come here and I run this file, you see that I do not get an error. Instead, I get undefined logged to the console. Undefined is a value logged to the console for the variable YouTube channel. And why is that the case? That is because undefined is a default value that is assigned to variables that are declared but are not given a value. Here we declared YouTube channel, we didn't assign any value to this variable, so by default the variable would hold the value of undefined. But now let's say I comment this line and then I do console.log Instagram account. If I come here now and I run this file, see, we have an error. This is a reference error that says Instagram account is not defined. When we try to log YouTube channel, we got undefined, we didn't get an error, but now we're trying to access Instagram account and then we get Instagram account is not defined. So not defined applies to variables that are not even declared. They do not exist. The JavaScript or interpreter doesn't know about such variable, and so it throws that reference error which says this variable is not defined. But in the case of undefined, JavaScript knows about the variable, but the variable doesn't have any value. So JavaScript is like, I'm going to give you a default value of undefined until you are assigned another value. So coming back to YouTube channel, for example, I can say let YouTube channel, I try to access YouTube channel here. Then let's say I give YouTube channel a value of Deeecode, and then now I try to access YouTube channel again. Now if I clear the console and I run this, you see first we get undefined, which is the default value that is given to this variable since it was declared without any value. But here I now give a value with a string of Deeecode to the variable, and then accessing the variable again, you now see we get the value that has now been assigned to the variable. So undefined, default value assigned to variables declared without a value, while not defined applies to variables that do not even exist. Now this is an example of a global scope. Let's see an example of a local scope. So I'm going to comment all of this. Now let's say we have a function called print. I like using print a lot. Now in this function, let's say we try to access username. Now I'm going to execute print. Now here if I run, or let me clear the console first. If I run this here, you see we get a reference error. By executing print, we try to access a variable called username here, but such variable doesn't exist. So now we have a reference error that says username is not defined. But now let's say I come here and I declare a variable called username, but I don't assign it any value, and I try to access username again. If I run this, you see, oops, that's my washing machine. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, I'm back. So now that we're trying to access username here, it says undefined. We declared username, but we didn't give it a value. So the default value it's going to hold is undefined. Now let's say I try to access username outside this function. We declared username in this print function, which means username is scoped to this function. This is the local scope of the variable. And now we're trying to access username outside. Watch what happens. If I run this, you see we get username is not defined. So what is happening here? Yes, we have a username variable, but that username variable is declared in a different scope of which this outside environment doesn't have access to. So in the outside environment, there is no username variable declared, and that is why we get not defined. This variable doesn't exist in this outside environment. But if we take this back inside and we try to run it, now the variable exists, but it doesn't have a value. So we get the default value of undefined. So when you're looking at variables, you also have to think about the environment in which those variables are declared. But the main concept is that undefined applies to variables that are declared without a value. So undefined is going to be that default value, while not defined applies to variables that do not even exist, and this depends on the environment. If you're trying to access a variable that exists in some other environment, you are still going to get not defined because that variable doesn't exist in the environment you are trying to access it in. Now, there are other cases where you can get undefined in JavaScript. I'm going to show you some of them. So I'm going to comment this part, clear my console. Let's say we have an object like this. It has a property of YouTube, and in this YouTube we have Deeecode, and now we do console.log obj.instagram. Now if we come here and we run this, you see we get undefined. Undefined also applies to properties that do not exist in an object. Here we are trying to access the Instagram property, but this property doesn't exist here, so we get undefined. Another way you can get undefined is, let's say we have an array, and in this array we're going to have orange, apple, and now let's say we try to do console log r with the index of 5. If we try to run this again, you see we have undefined. This array only has 2 items. The index of the first item is 0, the index of the second item is 1, but we're trying to access an item with the index of 5, and that doesn't exist. The array exists, but the index 5 does not exist, and then you get undefined. And another way you can get undefined is when you have a function that doesn't return anything. Let's say we have a function like hello, and this function doesn't return anything. Now if I try to do console.log and then I execute hello, so I want to log the value that is returned from executing hello. If I come here and I run this, you see again I get undefined. But if I come here and maybe I return hello and I run this, you see I now get hello. So undefined also applies to functions that do not return anything. By default, that function would return undefined. So undefined and not defined. Undefined is a default value that applies to variables declared without a value, or it can apply to object properties that do not exist, array indexes that do not exist, or functions that do not return anything, while not defined applies to variables that do not exist in the environment that you're trying to access such variable. I hope this simplifies the difference for you. I also have other simplified videos on JavaScript which you can check by clicking on this playlist at the right here. It should show. But if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, share, and subscribe for more simplified videos like this.